The mansion gleamed under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, its opulence almost suffocating. Evelyn Carlyle sat at the long dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap as laughter echoed around her. The Carlyle family's annual Christmas Eve dinner was the pinnacle of Brindlewood society, a night where wealth and influence gathered under one gilded roof. Yet, Evelyn felt invisible, as though she were a shadow among the living. Her father, Walter Carlyle, presided at the head of the table like a king. With his silver hair swept back and a sharp suit tailored to perfection, he exuded authority. He gestured grandly as he recounted another tale of business conquest, drawing polite laughter from the guests. Evelyn's heart clenched. She had heard this story a dozen times before, each retelling a reminder of the man's pride and the legacy he expected her to uphold. The clink of glasses and hum of conversation grew louder. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the tall windows framing the dining room. Beyond the frosted panes, the town of Brindlewood sparkled under a blanket of snow. The distant sound of carolers reached her ears, their melody gentle and inviting. It was a world apart from the cold glamour inside the Carlyle estate. "Evelyn," Walter's voice cut through her reverie, sharp and commanding. She looked up, startled. "You've been unusually quiet tonight." All eyes turned to her. The weight of their stares made her throat tighten. She managed a thin smile. "I'm just enjoying the evening, Father." He studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a dismissive wave, he turned back to his audience. Evelyn exhaled quietly, relief washing over her. As the dinner dragged on, Evelyn's thoughts grew heavier. She didn't belong here, trapped in a life of appearances and expectations. Her father's dominance, the endless charade of wealth, it had always stifled her. And tonight, it felt unbearable. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9. "I need some air," she murmured, rising from her seat. No one seemed to notice as she slipped away from the table, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She made her way to the front door, grabbing a wool coat from the hall closet. The cold hit her like a cleansing wave as she stepped outside. The estate's grand gates loomed ahead, and beyond them, the streets of Brindlewood buzzed with life. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then walked briskly down the driveway, the crunch of snow beneath her boots punctuating the silence. The town square was a sight to behold. Twinkling lights adorned every tree, and a towering Christmas tree stood at the center, its ornaments glinting like jewels. Families strolled hand in hand, their laughter mingling with the sweet strains of holiday music. Evelyn felt a pang of longing as she watched them. This was what Christmas should feel like: warm, genuine, alive. She wandered through the square, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Vendors called out cheerfully from wooden stalls, offering everything from steaming cups of cider to handcrafted ornaments. Evelyn bought a small gingerbread cookie, more for the sake of holding something than eating it. She was about to move on when she noticed a figure sitting on a bench near the fountain. The boy couldn't have been more than 11 or 12. He wore a threadbare jacket, and his face was smudged with dirt. His hands were stuffed into his sleeves, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold. He stared at the ground, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. Evelyn felt her heart tighten. She approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "Hello," she ventured, her voice soft. The boy's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" "Nothing," she replied quickly. You look cold. Do you have somewhere to go?" He scoffed, pulling his knees closer to his chest. "I'm fine. Go back to your fancy house." Evelyn was taken aback by his hostility, but she couldn't blame him. She glanced around, searching for any sign of a guardian, but the boy seemed entirely alone. "I'm not here to bother you," she said gently, "but if you need help—" "I don't need your pity," he snapped, cutting her off. His voice wavered slightly, betraying his bravado. Evelyn hesitated, unsure of how to break through his defenses. Then she took off her scarf, a soft woolen piece she had brought on a whim. She held it out to him. "Here. It's not much, but it's warm." The boy stared at the scarf, his jaw clenched. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might reject it outright. But then, with a quick, almost grudging motion, he snatched it from her hand. "Thanks," he muttered, his gaze dropping. Evelyn smiled faintly. "What's your name?" He hesitated before answering. "Theo." "I'm Evelyn," she said. "If you ever need anything, well, I'll be around." Theo didn't respond, but his grip on the scarf tightened. Evelyn stood there for a moment longer, then stepped away, giving him space. As she walked back toward the square, she felt something stir within her. A connection, fragile but undeniable. Evelyn spent the rest of the evening wandering the square, her thoughts tangled around the boy she had just met. Theo. His name stayed with her, lingering like the chill in the air. She had never been one to meddle in others' lives, but there was something about him, his defiance, his vulnerability, that she couldn't shake. As the bells of the town church rang out the hour, Evelyn realized it was time to return home. The thought of stepping back into the suffocating opulence of the Carlisle mansion filled her with dread, but the cold and late hour left her little choice. Pulling her coat tighter around her, she turned toward the winding path that led back to the estate. But as she neared the edge of the square, her footsteps faltered. She spotted Theo again, still sitting on the bench where she had left him. His small frame was hunched, his breath visible in the frosty night. The scarf she had given him was now wrapped tightly around his neck, but it was clear it wasn't enough to keep the biting cold at bay. Something inside her broke. Without fully forming a plan, Evelyn turned back toward him. "Theo," she called softly as she approached. His head snapped up, his expression guarded. "You again," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "I told you, I don't need help." "I know," she replied, stopping a few feet away. "But it's freezing out here, and I can't just leave you like this. Come with me." He stared at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "To where? Your big fancy house?" His tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of uncertainty beneath it. "Yes," she said simply. "At least for tonight. You can have a warm meal and a place to sleep. No strings attached." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Evelyn thought he would refuse, but then his shoulders sagged ever so slightly. "Just for tonight," he muttered. "And only because it's cold." Evelyn nodded, relief washing over her. "Come on." The walk back to the Carlisle estate was quiet, the only sounds their footsteps crunching in the snow and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Theo kept a few steps behind her, his wariness palpable. Evelyn didn't push him to talk. She could sense he wasn't ready for that. Instead, she focused on the path ahead, her mind racing with questions. Who was this boy? Why was he alone? And why did she feel so compelled to help him? When they reached the gates of the estate, Theo stopped in his tracks. His eyes widened as he took in the sprawling mansion, its grand facade illuminated by the glow of countless lights. "This is where you live?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Evelyn glanced back at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's not as impressive as it looks," she said. "Come on." They slipped inside through a side entrance, avoiding the prying eyes of the house staff. Evelyn led Theo to the kitchen, a cavernous space filled with polished marble and gleaming appliances. She rummaged through the pantry and fridge, pulling out leftovers from the lavish dinner earlier that evening. "Here," she said, setting a plate of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans in front of him. "It's not fresh, but it's good." Theo didn't respond, but his eyes betrayed his hunger. He hesitated for a moment before picking up the fork and digging in. Evelyn watched as he ate, her heart aching at the sight. He was just a child, forced to fend for himself in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. "Do you have family?" she asked gently, breaking the silence. Theo paused mid-bite, his gaze dropping to the plate. "I had a mom," he said after a moment. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "But we got separated. I don't know where she is." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. "How long have you been on your own?" "Long enough," he muttered, his tone defensive. "Why do you care, anyway?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because no one should have to go through what you're going through," she said finally. "And because I can help." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of trust in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He set down his fork, pushing the plate away. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice sharp. "It's not charity," Evelyn said firmly. "It's kindness. There's a difference." He didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the table. Evelyn sighed. Standing up, "Come on," she said. "Let's get you cleaned up and settled for the night." She led him to a small guest room on the far end of the mansion, away from the main quarters. The room was modest by Carlisle standards, but it was warm and comfortable. Theo stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, as Evelyn showed him the attached bathroom and set out a clean towel and a pair of her late brother's old pajamas. "I'll leave you to it," she said, stepping back. "If you need anything, my room is just down the hall." He nodded, his expression still guarded. As Evelyn turned to leave, he spoke, his voice hesitant. "Thanks." She paused, looking back at him. "You're welcome, Theo. Good night." As she walked down the hall to her own room, Evelyn felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for the boy's plight, anger at the circumstances that had led him to this point, and a deep, inexplicable sense of connection. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of purpose, a reason to push beyond the confines of her father's expectations. And as she lay in bed that night, the snow falling softly outside her window, Evelyn realized that her life, once so carefully controlled, was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The morning arrived quietly, with soft rays of winter sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains in Evelyn's room. She stirred awake, her thoughts immediately turning to the boy sleeping down the hall. She wondered if Theo was still there, half expecting him to have slipped away in the early hours. Pushing back her covers, she dressed quickly and headed toward the guest room. The door was ajar. She knocked lightly, but there was no response. Pushing it open, she found the bed neatly made and the room empty. For a moment, her heart sank. Perhaps he'd left, unwilling to trust her kindness. But as she turned to leave, she spotted him in the small sitting area near the window. He was perched on the edge of a chair, the scarf she had given him still wrapped around his neck, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "You're up early," Evelyn said softly, stepping into the room. Theo glanced over his shoulder, his expression cautious. "I didn't want to sleep in too long. Figured you'd want me gone." Evelyn frowned. "You don't have to go if you don't want to." He turned back to the window, his shoulders stiff. "I don't belong here." "Neither do I," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air, surprising both of them. Theo looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This house," she continued, gesturing vaguely. "It's never felt like home to me. Just a place I have to be." Theo didn't respond, but she saw something soften in his gaze. She sat down across from him, careful to keep her tone light. "Are you hungry? I could make us breakfast. Or at least attempt to." "Don't you have, like, 100 people who do that for you?" he asked, a hint of sarcasm slipping into his voice. Evelyn chuckled. "Probably. But they'd tell my father, and he'd start asking questions I don't feel like answering. So, what do you say? Pancakes?" Theo hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Sure." In the kitchen, Evelyn found herself enjoying the simple act of cooking. It had been years since she'd done anything so mundane, and though her skills were rusty, she managed to whip up a decent stack of pancakes. Theo sat at the counter, watching her cautiously, but with a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. As they ate, Evelyn tried to learn more about him. She asked simple questions, careful not to pry too deeply. Theo answered in clipped sentences, his guard still firmly in place, but she pieced together fragments of his story. His mother had worked long hours as a waitress, barely making ends meet. They'd lost their apartment when she fell behind on rent, and shortly after, they'd been separated. Theo had been living on the streets for months, surviving through sheer determination and grit. The more he spoke, the more Evelyn's heart ached for him. She saw echoes of her own loneliness in his defiance, his unwillingness to trust anyone. She wanted to help him, but she knew she needed to tread carefully. Theo wasn't the type to accept pity or charity, and she didn't want to drive him away. After breakfast, Evelyn took him on a tour of the mansion. It was partly an excuse to keep him inside, out of the cold, but also an opportunity to show him a side of her life that felt just as foreign to her as it probably did to him. She led him through the grand hallways, pointing out portraits of ancestors she barely knew in rooms that were rarely used. Theo seemed unimpressed, though he perked up slightly when they reached the library. "This is where I used to hide," Evelyn said, gesturing to a cozy nook by the window. "When I was a kid, I'd spend hours here reading, pretending I was anywhere else but here." Theo ran a finger along the edge of a bookshelf, his expression thoughtful. "You really don't like this place, do you?" "It's not the place," she admitted. "It's the people. My father especially. He has very specific ideas about how things should be, and I've never really fit into them." Theo nodded as if he understood. "My mom used to say I didn't fit into her world either. But not because she didn't want me to. It was just hard, you know?" Evelyn nodded, her throat tightening. "I'm sure she loves you very much." Theo didn't respond, but the way he turned his face away told her everything. He missed his mother deeply, and the pain of their separation was something he carried every day. As the day wore on, Evelyn found herself growing more protective of Theo. She wanted to do more than just give him a warm bed for the night. She wanted to help him find his mother, reunite them if it was possible. But she knew she couldn't do it alone, and she knew her father would disapprove of her even trying. That evening, as the sky darkened and the lights of the mansion flickered on, Evelyn made a decision. She wouldn't let Theo slip through the cracks the way so many others had. He deserved a chance, and she was determined to give it to him. Sitting across from Theo at the dinner table, she spoke with quiet determination. "Tomorrow, we're going to figure this out," she said. "We'll start looking for your mom." Theo's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone. And because no one should have to go through that, especially not at Christmas." He didn't say anything, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of trust in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn felt a strange sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had let herself drift, confined by her father's expectations and the emptiness of her life. But now, with Theo in the house, she felt like she was finally waking up to something bigger than herself. The snow continued to fall softly outside her window, blanketing the world in a hush. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn allowed herself to hope. The morning brought a crisp brightness to the world outside, with sunlight reflecting off the blanket of snow that covered the estate grounds. Evelyn woke early, her mind already buzzing with plans. Today, she and Theo would begin the search for his mother. She had no idea where to start or how long it might take, but she felt an unshakable resolve to try. Theo was already in the kitchen when she arrived, seated at the counter with a glass of orange juice. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded as always. "You're up early," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Couldn't sleep much," he replied, his tone neutral. Evelyn nodded and began making coffee, giving him space to wake up fully. As the aroma of the brewing coffee filled the kitchen, she turned to him. "I thought we could start by going to some of the shelters in town," she said. "Maybe someone there knows your mom or has seen her recently." Theo didn't respond immediately, staring down at the counter instead. Finally, he said, "What if we don't find anything?" "We won't know until we try," she said gently. "But I promise I'm not giving up." His eyes flicked up to hers, and she saw the uncertainty there. He wanted to believe her, but years of disappointment had made it difficult for him to trust anyone. She understood that and didn't press him further. Instead, she grabbed her coat and motioned for him to do the same. "Come on," she said. "Let's get started." They took Evelyn's car, a sleek but understated sedan that contrasted sharply with the grandeur of the Carlisle estate. As they drove into town, Theo sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. Evelyn tried to make small talk, but his answers were brief, his focus elsewhere. She let the silence settle, hoping he would open up in his own time. Their first stop was a shelter near the edge of town. It was a modest building with a cheerful wreath on the door and a line of people waiting to enter. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the comforting scent of soup and bread. Evelyn approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted her. "Hi," Evelyn began. "We're looking for someone. Her name is," She turned to Theo, realizing she didn't know his mother's full name. Rebecca Simmons, Theo said quietly. The woman at the desk frowned and tapped the name into her computer. I don't recall anyone by that name recently, she said, but I can check our records. Give me a moment. While they waited, Theo wandered over to a bulletin board filled with flyers and notices. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching at the way his small frame seemed even smaller in this place. He looked so out of place yet so familiar with the environment, as if it were a part of his world she could never fully understand. The woman returned with an apologetic shake of her head. I'm sorry, but there's no one here by that name. Thank you, Evelyn said, her disappointment carefully masked. She touched Theo's shoulder gently. Let's try somewhere else. They visited 2 more shelters that morning, each time met with the same response. No one had seen Rebecca Simmons, and no one could offer them any new leads. By midday, Evelyn could feel the weight of discouragement pressing down on both of them. They stopped at a diner for lunch, where Theo poked at his grilled cheese sandwich in silence. It's not going to be easy, Evelyn said after a while, but that doesn't mean we stop. Sometimes finding the right answers takes time. Theo glanced up at her, his eyes shadowed. You don't have to do this, you know. Yes, I do, she said firmly. You're not in this alone anymore, Theo. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he looked back down at his plate. She didn't press him, sensing that he needed time to process her words. Instead, she shifted the conversation to lighter topics, asking about his favorite foods and movies. He answered reluctantly at first, but eventually started to share small glimpses of his personality. A sharp sense of humor, a love for comic books, and an impressive knowledge of old action movies. After lunch, they continued their search, visiting another shelter and speaking with a few shopkeepers in the area. By late afternoon, they had no new information, and Evelyn could see the exhaustion in Theo's face. She decided to call it a day, promising they would try again tomorrow. As they drove back to the mansion, Theo finally broke the silence. "Why are you really helping me?" he asked, his tone a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Evelyn tightened her grip on the steering wheel, considering her response. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost," she said after a moment. "To feel like no one sees you or cares about what happens to you. I don't want that for you." Theo didn't reply, but she caught him glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. She hoped her words had reached him, even if he wasn't ready to say so. Back at the mansion, they retreated to their respective rooms, both too tired to talk much. Evelyn lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something big, something that could change both of their lives forever. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was determined to face it head-on. The snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the world in quiet. And somewhere in the vast, still night, Evelyn allowed herself a small, fragile hope that their journey would lead them to something better. The next morning, Evelyn was already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when Theo shuffled in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. She had made toast and scrambled eggs, though she wasn't sure if he'd eat much. He sat down without a word, eyeing the plate she slid in front of him. "We'll keep looking today," she said after a few moments of silence. "I was thinking we could check the church downtown. Sometimes people leave messages or contact information there for family members." Theo nodded, poking at his food with his fork. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. Evelyn could see the weight of disappointment from the previous day still hanging over him, but she didn't want to push too hard. He had trusted her enough to stay, and that was a start. She only hoped that trust would grow as they continued their search. The drive to the church was a short one, but the air between them felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Evelyn wanted to tell him that it was okay to feel discouraged, that these things took time, but she didn't know if he was ready to hear it. Instead, she focused on the road, navigating the snowy streets with care. The church was a simple building, its brick walls adorned with evergreen garlands and twinkling white lights. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with beeswax and pine. A tall Christmas tree stood near the altar, its ornaments shimmering in the soft glow of candlelight. Evelyn led Theo to the small office at the back of the church, where a kindly older man greeted them. He introduced himself as Father Daniels and listened intently as Evelyn explained their situation. Rebecca Simmons, Father Daniels repeated, stroking his chin thoughtfully. The name does sound familiar. Let me check our records. He disappeared into a side room, leaving Evelyn and Theo alone. Theo wandered over to a bulletin board near the door, scanning the notices and handwritten notes pinned there. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching as she imagined what he must be feeling. Hope and fear intertwined, each pulling him in a different direction. Father Daniels returned a few minutes later with a folder in hand. We did have a Rebecca Simmons listed in our outreach program about a year ago, he said. She was staying at a shelter in the next town over, but I haven't seen her since. Theo's shoulders tensed, and he turned to face the priest. Do you know if she's still there? He asked, his voice urgent. Father Daniels shook his head. I'm afraid I don't, but I can give you the address of the shelter. They might have more information. Evelyn accepted the slip of paper with the address and thanked the priest. As they left the church, she glanced at Theo, who was clutching the paper tightly in his hand. She could see a spark of hope in his eyes, faint but undeniable. We'll go there next, she said as they got into the car. The drive to the neighboring town was quiet, Theo staring out the window while Evelyn focused on navigating the icy roads. The shelter was a modest brick building tucked away on a side street, its exterior weathered but welcoming. Inside, the atmosphere was bustling, with volunteers handing out meals and assisting people who had come in from the cold. Evelyn approached the front desk, where a young woman greeted her with a warm smile. Hi, Evelyn began. We're looking for someone. Rebecca Simmons. She may have stayed here about a year ago. The woman's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at Theo, who was standing close to Evelyn. Rebecca Simmons, she repeated, tapping at her keyboard. Yes, she was here for a while, but she left several months ago. I'm sorry, I don't have any updated information. Theo's face fell, and Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Do you know if she left any messages or notes for someone who might be looking for her? Evelyn asked. The woman thought for a moment, then nodded. Actually, I think she did. Let me check our files. She disappeared into a back room, and Evelyn turned to Theo. This could be something, she said softly. Let's see what she finds. After a few minutes, the woman returned with a small envelope. She left this with instructions to give it to anyone who came looking for her, she said, handing it to Theo. Theo took the envelope with trembling hands, staring at it as if it might vanish at any moment. Evelyn guided him to a nearby bench, where he sat down and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, handwritten note. Asterisk Theo. I'm so sorry we were separated. I've been trying to find a way back to you, but it's been hard. If you find this, know that I love you more than anything in the world. I'm staying in Crestwood now. The address is below. Please come find me. Love, Mom asterisk. Theo's hands tightened around the note, and Evelyn saw tears welling up in his eyes. She's looking for me, he whispered, his voice cracking. She didn't forget about me. Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat as she placed a comforting hand on his back. Of course she didn't, she said gently. She loves you, Theo, and now we know where to find her. He nodded, clutching the note to his chest. For the first time since she had met him, Evelyn saw the walls around him begin to crumble. The boy who had been so guarded and tough now looked vulnerable, hopeful, and deeply human. We'll go to Crestwood tomorrow, Evelyn said. We're going to bring you back to her. Theo looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they left the shelter and stepped back into the cold, Evelyn felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. She had promised Theo she wouldn't give up, and now, with his mother's note in hand, she knew they were closer than ever to reuniting him with the family he so desperately missed. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Theo clutched his mother's note tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Evelyn didn't press him to talk, sensing the mixture of emotions he must be feeling. Relief, hope, and perhaps even fear. The note was a promise, but it also came with uncertainty. Would his mother still be in Crestwood? What if something had changed? Evelyn had no answers to offer, only the determination to help him see this through. That evening, Evelyn found herself unable to sit still. She paced the library, her thoughts racing. Theo had retreated to the guest room shortly after dinner, saying little but offering a quiet good night as he left the table. Evelyn had let him go, knowing he needed time to process everything. Still, she felt a deep responsibility to make sure they followed through on his mother's words. Crestwood wasn't far, just a couple of hours by car, but Evelyn wanted to make sure they were prepared. She spent the next hour online, researching the address from the note. It led to a modest apartment complex, one that seemed a world away from the Carlisle estate. She made a mental list of what they might need for the trip: warm clothes, snacks for Theo, and perhaps a small gift for his mother, something thoughtful but not overwhelming. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the library door. Turning, she saw Theo standing there, looking smaller and younger than he had in days. The note was still in his hand, slightly crumpled from his grip. He hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether he was welcome. "You can come in," Evelyn said gently, setting aside the book she hadn't been reading. Theo stepped inside, his movements cautious. He glanced around the room, taking in the shelves of books and the soft glow of the fireplace. "This place looks like it's from a movie," he said, his voice quiet but tinged with curiosity. "It feels like one sometimes," Evelyn replied with a small smile. "Mostly the kind where people get trapped in their own castles." Theo gave a faint chuckle, surprising both of them. He moved closer to the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. "Do you think she's really there?" he asked after a long pause. Evelyn's smile faded into something softer, more serious. "I think your mother loves you very much," she said. "And if she left that note, it means she wanted you to find her." "That's what we're going to do." Theo nodded, his expression hard to read. He looked down at the note again, tracing the words with his fingers. "I don't remember the last thing I said to her," he admitted. "What if she's mad at me?" "She won't be," Evelyn said firmly. "Mothers don't stop loving their children, no matter what." Theo glanced at her, as if trying to gauge the truth of her words. Finally, he nodded again. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow." Evelyn smiled. "Tomorrow." That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn found herself thinking about her own mother. She had died when Evelyn was young, leaving her to be raised under the strict, unyielding rule of her father. Walter Carlyle wasn't a cruel man, but he was a distant one, more concerned with his empire than with his daughter. Evelyn wondered what her mother would have thought of all this, of Theo, of her determination to help him. She hoped she would have been proud. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. Evelyn was up early, packing a small bag with the essentials for their trip. She added a few extra items for Theo: a warm hat, gloves, and a scarf she had found in one of the closets. When she knocked on his door, he was already dressed, the note carefully folded and tucked into his pocket. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, let's go." The drive to Crestwood was quiet at first, but as they left Brindlewood behind, Theo began to ask questions. He wanted to know what the apartment complex looked like, what they would say when they got there, what they would do if his mother wasn't home. Evelyn answered as best as she could, her calm tone masking her own uncertainties. She didn't know what they would find in Crestwood, but she was determined to make sure Theo didn't face it alone. When they arrived, the apartment complex looked exactly as Evelyn had imagined. Simple, clean, and unassuming. A few children played in the snow near the entrance, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Evelyn parked the car and turned to Theo. "This is it," she said. "Are you ready?" Theo hesitated, his hand going to his pocket where the note was. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, I think so." They walked to the building together, Evelyn letting Theo take the lead. The address from the note led them to a door on the second floor, its number slightly crooked but otherwise unremarkable. Theo stopped in front of it, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Evelyn knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take your time," she said softly. "Whenever you're ready." He nodded, his jaw tight. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the doorbell. The seconds that followed felt like hours. Evelyn could hear the faint sound of footsteps inside, the muffled noise growing louder as someone approached the door. When it opened, the woman standing there was exactly as Evelyn had imagined. Tired but kind, her face lighting up the moment she saw Theo. "Theo," she said, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Theo." Theo didn't say a word. He threw himself into her arms, clutching her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. Rebecca wrapped her arms around him, her tears falling freely as she held him close. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find you." "I thought you forgot about me," Theo said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Never," Rebecca said firmly, pulling back just enough to look at him. "Not for 1 second." Evelyn stepped back, giving them space. She felt her own eyes welling with tears, overwhelmed by the raw emotion of the reunion. This was what Theo had been searching for, what he had needed most. And now, he had it. Rebecca looked up, noticing Evelyn for the first time. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Evelyn smiled. "It was all him," she said. "I just helped him find the way." As the three of them stood in the small hallway, the weight of everything that had come before seemed to lift. Theo had found his way home, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she had, too. The small apartment was modest but warm, with faded but clean furniture and the comforting smell of something baking in the oven. Rebecca ushered Theo inside, still clutching his hand as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. Evelyn followed at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude on their reunion, but unable to stop herself from watching the tender scene unfold. Theo moved through the apartment cautiously, his wide eyes taking in the details. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with mismatched ornaments and a star made of tinfoil at the top. A stack of neatly wrapped gifts sat beneath it, their colorful paper and crooked bows betraying the effort that had gone into preparing for a holiday that Rebecca must have hoped to share with him. "You've been waiting for him," Evelyn said softly, stepping into the living room. Rebecca turned to her, her eyes red but her smile unwavering. "Every day," she said. "I didn't know if he'd ever find me, but I couldn't give up." Theo ran his fingers over a framed photo on a side table, a picture of him as a toddler in his mother's arms. "You kept this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," Rebecca said, coming up behind him. She rested a hand on his shoulder. "I never stopped hoping you'd come back." Evelyn stood quietly near the doorway, giving them space. She could see the bond between them, the love that had been strained but never broken by time or distance. It was a reminder of how powerful and resilient family could be, even in the face of hardship. After a while, Rebecca turned to Evelyn. "You've done so much for him," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "He's an incredible boy. I'm just glad I could help." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of curiosity. "You didn't have to do this, though. Why did you?" Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much of her own story to share. But there was something in Rebecca's eyes, an openness, a willingness to listen, that made her want to be honest. "I know what it's like to feel alone," she said finally, "to feel like you don't belong. And I didn't want Theo to go through that." Rebecca nodded slowly, as if understanding more than Evelyn had said. "Well, whatever your reasons, you've given us a gift I can never repay." Evelyn smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Just seeing you two together is enough." They spent the afternoon together, Rebecca insisting that Evelyn stay for lunch. It was a simple meal, soup and bread, but it was served with such care that Evelyn found it more satisfying than any of the elaborate feasts at the Carlisle mansion. Theo seemed to come alive in the comfort of his mother's presence, his guarded demeanor softening as he talked and laughed in a way Evelyn hadn't seen before. As they ate, Rebecca shared more about the challenges she had faced. After losing her job and their apartment, she had done everything she could to keep Theo with her, but the system had been unrelenting. When they were separated, she had moved to Crestwood in search of work and stability, leaving messages and notes wherever she could in the hope that Theo might one day find her. "It was the hardest thing I've ever been through," she said, her voice trembling. "But I never stopped believing we'd find our way back to each other." Theo looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, "for not being stronger." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table to take his hand. "You were stronger than I ever could have been," she said. "You made it through, and you found me. That's all that matters." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched them. She had always thought of herself as an outsider, someone who couldn't truly understand the bond between a mother and child. But seeing Theo and Rebecca together, she felt something shift within her. A quiet longing for connection, for belonging, that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. As the day turned to evening, Rebecca lit a few candles and turned on the small string of lights around the Christmas tree. The apartment glowed softly, the humble decorations giving the space a magical warmth. Theo sat beside the tree, carefully inspecting the gifts beneath it. Rebecca laughed as she watched him, her joy so pure and radiant that Evelyn couldn't help but smile. "You've made his Christmas," Rebecca said, turning to Evelyn. "He's made mine," Evelyn replied honestly. It was late by the time Evelyn finally prepared to leave. She had offered to stay the night, but Rebecca insisted that she and Theo needed some time alone to fully reconnect. Evelyn understood, though part of her was reluctant to go. She had grown attached to Theo in ways she hadn't expected, and the thought of saying goodbye was harder than she had anticipated. As she slipped on her coat, Theo came to her side. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes betraying the depth of his question. Evelyn smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "If you want me to," she said. He nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, I do. I'll be here," she promised. Rebecca hugged her tightly before she left, whispering another heartfelt thank you. Evelyn walked out into the crisp night air, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. She glanced back at the apartment, seeing the warm glow of the lights inside, and felt a deep sense of peace. She had helped bring Theo home, but in some ways, she felt like she had found a home, too, a connection that reminded her of what truly mattered. Driving back to Brindlewood, the quiet of the car gave Evelyn time to reflect. For so long, her life had been defined by the expectations of her father and the empty luxury of the Carlisle estate. But now, she felt a pull towards something more meaningful, a life that was less about appearances and more about substance. When she arrived at the mansion, the sprawling estate felt even larger and colder than usual. Evelyn stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the grand foyer. She thought of Theo and Rebecca in their small apartment, the warmth and love that filled that space, and realized that she wanted that for herself. Not the grandiosity of the Carlisle name, but the simple joy of being truly connected to others. That night, as she lay in her vast, empty bed, Evelyn found herself imagining a different kind of future, one where she wasn't just her father's daughter, but someone who had made a difference in the world. And for the first time in years, the idea didn't feel impossible. It felt real. The following morning, Evelyn awoke with a sense of determination. The events of the previous day had shifted something deep within her, and she couldn't ignore it. Theo and Rebecca's reunion had reminded her of the kind of life she wanted to build, not one defined by wealth or status, but by meaning, connection, and purpose. She dressed quickly, eager to return to Crestwood. Downstairs, the mansion was quiet. The household staff moved efficiently through their morning routines, but Evelyn barely noticed. Her father, Walter Carlisle, sat in the grand dining room, reading the newspaper as he sipped his coffee. He glanced up as Evelyn walked by, his expression as unreadable as always. "You're up early," he said, folding the paper neatly and setting it aside. "Off to do more charity work?" The edge in his tone was unmistakable, but Evelyn didn't rise to it. She paused in the doorway, meeting his gaze with a calmness she hadn't felt in years. "I'm helping someone who needed me," she said simply. "Something I should have been doing a long time ago." Walter raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing into a thin line. "And what exactly are you accomplishing with all this? Running around playing savior won't change the fact that people like that boy. What was his name? Theo, don't belong in our world." Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Maybe it's not about what world we belong to," she said. "Maybe it's about making the world better for everyone." Walter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, behind his eyes. He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, clearly dismissing the conversation. Evelyn didn't wait for his response. She turned and left, her steps firm as she made her way to the car. The drive to Crestwood felt shorter than the day before, as if the anticipation of seeing Theo and Rebecca again had quickened the journey. When she arrived at their apartment, she was greeted by the sight of Theo waiting outside, bundled in his coat and scarf. His face lit up when he saw her, and he ran down the steps to meet her. "You're back," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I promised, didn't I?" Evelyn replied, smiling as she ruffled his hair. "How was your morning?" "Good," he said. "Mom made pancakes, and we talked a lot. She said she's going to try to find a better job, so we can move to a bigger place." Evelyn's heart warmed at his optimism. "That's great, Theo. You both deserve it." Rebecca appeared at the door, waving as she came down to join them. "Evelyn, I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Theo hasn't stopped talking about yesterday." "It was a pretty big day," Evelyn said with a laugh. "I'm glad I got to be a part of it." Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about what's next. I don't want Theo to have to worry about anything. He's been through enough." Evelyn nodded, sensing the weight of Rebecca's words. "What can I do to help?" she asked. Rebecca looked at her, gratitude softening her features. "You've already done so much. But if you know of any opportunities, anything that could help me get back on my feet faster, I'd be grateful." Evelyn considered this as they walked back into the apartment. She had resources, more than she could ever use, and connections through her family's vast network. It was a delicate balance, though. She didn't want to overstep or make Rebecca feel indebted to her. But she knew she couldn't just walk away from their lives now. "I might have a few ideas," Evelyn said carefully. "There are organizations in Brindlewood that focus on helping families get stable housing and employment. I could make some calls if you'd like." Rebecca's eyes brightened. "That would mean so much. I want to make sure Theo has everything he needs." Theo, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I just want us to stay together. That's all I need." Evelyn smiled at him, her chest tightening with emotion. "And that's exactly what's going to happen." They spent the afternoon discussing plans and possibilities. Evelyn made a few discreet phone calls to local contacts, planting the seeds for opportunities that could help Rebecca rebuild her life. She didn't tell Rebecca everything. There was still a part of her that worried about how her father might react if he found out, but she was determined to do what she could. As the day wore on, Theo grew more animated, his initial shyness fading as he shared stories about his life before he and Rebecca had been separated. He talked about the games they used to play, the books she would read to him at night, and the small traditions they had created together. "It was just the two of us, but it was enough," he said, his voice quiet but content. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with love. "And it will be again," she said. "I promise." By the time evening arrived, Evelyn felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. Helping Rebecca and Theo wasn't just about them. It was about reclaiming something she had lost in herself, the ability to care deeply, to act with purpose, to feel connected to something larger than her own struggles. As she prepared to leave, Rebecca hugged her tightly. "You've changed our lives, Evelyn," she said. "I'll never forget what you've done for us." Evelyn shook her head, smiling. "You would have found each other eventually," she said. "I just gave fate a little nudge." Theo walked her to the car, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Evelyn hesitated, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him. "I think it's time for you and your mom to have some time together," she said gently. "But I'll check in soon. I promise." Theo nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for everything," he said. "I mean it." Evelyn smiled, ruffling his hair one last time. "You're a pretty great kid, Theo. Don't forget that." As she drove away, the lights of Crestwood fading in her rearview mirror, Evelyn felt a profound sense of clarity. She didn't know what the future held for Rebecca and Theo, but she knew they would make it through. They had each other, and that was enough. For Evelyn, the journey wasn't over. She still had her own life to untangle, her own path to find. But for the first time, she felt like she was heading in the right direction, toward a life that was less about wealth and power and more about the quiet, simple moments that made everything worthwhile. And as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could create a future as bright and hopeful as the one she had glimpsed in Theo's smile. Evelyn returned to the Carlisle mansion that night, her thoughts swirling with everything she had experienced over the past few days. The grand estate felt even more hollow than usual as she walked through its ornate halls. The silence wasn't soothing. It was oppressive, a stark contrast to the warmth and life she had felt in Rebecca's modest apartment. For the first time, Evelyn truly understood the emptiness that had defined so much of her existence. The wealth and status that her father prized had never brought her any sense of belonging. In the days that followed, Evelyn threw herself into making good on her promises. She connected Rebecca with organizations in Brindlewood that could help with housing and employment, ensuring that she would have a solid foundation to rebuild her life. Evelyn was careful not to overstep, framing her assistance as opportunities Rebecca could choose to take if she wanted. To her relief, Rebecca was receptive and determined, eager to do whatever it took to create a stable home for Theo. Evelyn also kept in touch with Theo, calling him in the evenings to hear about his day. Their conversations were simple. He told her about the snowball fights he had with the kids in the apartment complex, how his mom had found a part-time job at a local diner, and the Christmas decorations they were putting up together. His voice was lighter, filled with a happiness Evelyn hadn't heard before, and it made her heart swell to know he was finally where he belonged. Despite her efforts to keep her involvement discreet, Walter soon noticed her preoccupation. At first, he made only passing comments, questioning why she spent so much time away from home and what she was working on so intently. Evelyn brushed him off, unwilling to explain. But one evening, as she was going over paperwork related to the organizations helping Rebecca, Walter confronted her in his study. "Evelyn," he said, his voice sharp as he entered the room, "I think it's time you told me exactly what you've been up to." Evelyn looked up from the desk, her pulse quickening. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't prepared for it. "I've been helping someone," she said carefully, keeping her tone calm. "A mother and her son. They were separated, and I helped them find each other again." Walter's expression darkened. "And what, exactly, does that have to do with you?" "We have charities for this sort of thing." "It's not about charity," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "It's about doing something that matters. Something real." Walter scoffed, pacing in front of the desk. "You think this pet project of yours is real?" "Evelyn, we are the Carlyles. We have a reputation to maintain. Running around trying to fix other people's problems is beneath you." Evelyn stood, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Beneath me? Father, have you ever stopped to think about what really matters? About what we could do with everything we have, helping Theo and his mother. It's the first time I felt like my life meant something." Walter turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you expect to accomplish? You're wasting your time, Evelyn. People like them will always be dependent on people like us." Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. "They're not dependent on us," she said firmly. "They're stronger than you'll ever understand. And maybe if you spent less time looking down on everyone else, you'd see that." Walter's face hardened, but Evelyn didn't flinch. For so long, she had let him dictate the terms of her life, but not anymore. She had found something worth standing up for, and she wasn't going to back down. "I won't stop helping them," she said. "And if that's a problem for you, then so be it." Walter stared at her, his silence heavy. Finally, he turned away, his voice cold as he said, "Do what you want, Evelyn. Just don't expect me to support your foolishness." Evelyn left the study without another word, her heart pounding. The confrontation had been draining, but it had also solidified her resolve. She knew she couldn't expect her father to change overnight, perhaps not ever, but she was no longer seeking his approval. She had her own path to follow. The next day, Evelyn visited Rebecca and Theo again. This time, she brought a small gift, a framed photo she had taken of Theo and Rebecca during their reunion. When she handed it to them, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and Theo grinned widely. "It's perfect," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Evelyn. This means so much to us." Evelyn smiled, her heart warming at their gratitude. "It's just a little something," she said, "but I thought it might remind you of how far you've come." They spent the afternoon together, decorating the apartment and making plans for the holidays. Theo insisted on showing Evelyn the Christmas tree he had helped pick out, proudly pointing out the ornaments he had made with his mother. The room was filled with laughter and light, and Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of joy simply being there with them. As the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, Rebecca pulled Evelyn aside. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you," she said. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible." "You don't need to repay me," Evelyn said. "Just keep building this life together. That's all I want to see." Rebecca hugged her tightly, and Evelyn felt the strength of their bond. It wasn't just about helping them. It was about being part of something meaningful, something that had changed her as much as it had changed them. When Evelyn left that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. She knew there were still challenges ahead, both for herself and for Rebecca and Theo, but she also knew they would face them with the same determination that had brought them together. For the first time, Evelyn felt like she was truly living, not just existing. And as she drove home under the soft glow of the stars, she felt a quiet sense of hope, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Christmas Eve arrived with a crisp chill in the air and a light dusting of snow covering the ground. Evelyn spent the morning wrapping gifts in the quiet of the library, her mind drifting to Theo and Rebecca. The past weeks had been transformative for her, and the thought of spending Christmas with them filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. By late afternoon, she loaded her car with the carefully wrapped packages and a basket of baked goods she'd asked the kitchen staff to prepare. As she pulled away from the Carlisle mansion, she felt a twinge of sadness, knowing she was leaving behind a house filled with tradition but devoid of real joy. Yet, she didn't look back for long. Her focus was ahead, on the family she had chosen to celebrate with. When Evelyn arrived at Rebecca's apartment, she was greeted by the sound of laughter spilling out into the hallway. Theo opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw her. "You made it," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her inside. The apartment had been transformed into a cozy holiday haven. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner, surrounded by neatly wrapped presents. A string of lights framed the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her face beaming. "You're just in time," Rebecca said. "Dinner's almost ready." Evelyn smiled, setting her gifts down near the tree. "Everything smells amazing," she said. "Can I help with anything?" Rebecca waved her off. "You've done more than enough. Just sit and relax. Theo's been dying to show you his new game." Theo led Evelyn to the small living room, where he proudly displayed a board game he and his mother had been playing together. As he explained the rules with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, Evelyn couldn't help but marvel at how much he had changed. The guarded, cautious boy she had met weeks ago had been replaced by someone bright, hopeful, and full of life. It was a transformation that spoke volumes about the power of love and belonging. Dinner was a simple but delicious affair: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and an assortment of vegetables. The conversation flowed easily, filled with stories and laughter. Evelyn felt more at home than she ever had at the grand Carlisle dining table, where every word and gesture was scrutinized under the weight of expectation. Here, there was no pretense, only genuine connection. After dinner, they gathered around the tree to exchange gifts. Theo's eyes lit up as he opened each present, his excitement infectious. Evelyn had chosen a set of books she thought he would enjoy, along with a few art supplies after learning about his love for drawing. Rebecca had tears in her eyes as she unwrapped a delicate bracelet Evelyn had picked out, its simple design meant to symbolize strength and resilience. As the evening wound down, they sat together on the couch, sipping hot cocoa and watching the snow fall outside the window. Theo had curled up beside his mother, his head resting on her shoulder. Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that this was exactly where she was meant to be. But the night wasn't over yet. A knock at the door startled them all, and Rebecca rose to answer it, her brow furrowed in confusion. When she opened the door, Evelyn heard a familiar voice, her father's. Walter Carlisle stepped into the apartment, his presence as commanding as ever, though there was a hesitance in his movements that Evelyn had never seen before. He held a large box wrapped in gold paper, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on Evelyn. "Father," Evelyn said, standing slowly. "What are you doing here?" Walter cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to see for myself," he said, "to understand what's been taking so much of your time." Rebecca looked at Evelyn, her face a mix of surprise and unease. Theo clung to his mother's arm, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the man who had just entered their home. "It's okay," Evelyn said gently, stepping toward her father. "This is Rebecca and Theo." Walter nodded stiffly, his gaze lingering on Theo for a moment before he turned back to Evelyn. "You've spoken a lot about helping them," he said, "and I'll admit I didn't understand. I still don't fully, but I wanted to try." He handed the box to Theo, who accepted it reluctantly. With a glance at his mother, Theo tore off the paper to reveal a wooden train set, intricately designed and painted. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he was speechless. "Thank you," Theo said finally, his voice small but sincere. Walter nodded, his expression softening. "You're welcome." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the exchange. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. A step toward understanding, a bridge between two worlds that had seemed irreconcilable. Rebecca invited Walter to join them, and though he seemed out of place in the humble apartment, he accepted. The rest of the evening passed quietly, with conversation that grew easier as the hours went on. Walter listened more than he spoke, his usual air of authority replaced by something gentler, almost tentative. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas Day, Evelyn looked around the room. Rebecca and Theo sat together, their bond unshakable. Walter sat nearby, his presence a reminder that even the most rigid hearts could begin to soften. And Evelyn herself felt a sense of belonging she had spent her entire life searching for. It wasn't the Christmas she had expected, but it was the one she had needed. A reminder that family wasn't just about blood or tradition, but about the choices we make to care for one another. Evelyn had chosen to help Theo and Rebecca, but in doing so, she had found her own place in a world that had always felt so distant. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in quiet, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that this was only the beginning. A new chapter filled with love, purpose, and the kind of joy that couldn't be bought or earned, only given and shared. And for the first time in years, she felt truly, deeply at peace.